The screams started at dawn when the river broke its banks, but Josephine Fairweather did not hear them until the water was already lapping at the wooden steps of the boarding house, where she had been staying for the past 3 weeks in Granite, Montana Territory. It was May of 1876, and the spring melt had been brutal that year. The mountains surrounding the small mining town had received more snow than anyone could remember, and when the warm weather finally arrived, it came all at once. The Clark Fork River, which normally ran peaceful and clear through the valley, had transformed into a raging brown monster that devoured everything in its path. Josephine had been sleeping when the first shouts echoed through the streets. She was 22 years old, a schoolteacher from Boston who had traveled west with dreams of independence and adventure. Her father had died the previous winter, leaving her with nothing but debts, and the realization that proper Boston society had no place for a woman without means or family connections. The advertisement for a teaching position in the Montana Territory had seemed like providence, and she had used the last of her savings to make the journey. She had arrived in Granite 3 weeks ago to find that the school had burned down 2 months prior, and the town council had decided not to rebuild until the following year. They offered her room and board at the boarding house until she could arrange passage back east, but Josephine had no money for passage and no home to return to. She had been taking in mending and laundry to earn her keep, trying to figure out what to do next. Now she stood at the window of her second-floor room, watching in horror as the water surged down Main Street. It was not the gentle rising of a normal flood. This was violent and fast, carrying with it trees, debris, and the remnants of structures that had already been swept away upstream. The noise was deafening, a roar that sounded like 1,000 trains bearing down on the little town. Josephine could not swim. She had never learned. In Boston, proper young ladies did not go swimming, and there had never been an opportunity or a reason to learn. Now, as she watched the water climb higher and higher, that lack of knowledge filled her with a terror so profound she could barely breathe. The boarding house was one of the newer structures in town, built on a slight rise, but the water was coming too fast. She could hear Mrs. Henderson, the proprietress, shouting for everyone to get upstairs, but Josephine knew that might not be enough. The building was already groaning under the assault of the current, and she could feel the vibrations through the floorboards. She grabbed her carpetbag and stuffed in what she could, her hands shaking so badly she could barely close the clasps. She had so few possessions that everything fit easily. A few changes of clothes, her mother's Bible, a daguerreotype of her parents, and the small bundle of letters from her father. Everything else she owned in the world. The water broke through the front door with a crash that shook the entire structure. Josephine heard Mrs. Henderson scream, and then there was a terrible splintering sound. She ran to her door and yanked it open, looking down the hallway toward the stairs. Water was already rushing up them, moving faster than seemed possible. There were 5 other people staying at the boarding house, and she could hear them all now, their voices rising in panic. Mr. and Mrs. Kimball, an elderly couple who were visiting their son in the mines. Sarah Miller, a widow who worked at the general store. Tom Brewster, a young clerk, and Mrs. Henderson herself. The building lurched suddenly, and Josephine was thrown against the wall. The entire structure was moving, being pushed off its foundation by the force of the water. She knew with absolute certainty that the building was going to collapse, and when it did, she was going to die. She ran back into her room and threw open the window. The water was perhaps 6 feet below her, churning and brown and filled with debris. Even if she had known how to swim, she doubted she could survive in that maelstrom. But staying in the building meant certain death. The building lurched again, tilting at a sickening angle. Josephine heard the screaming of timber giving way, the crash of walls collapsing. She climbed out onto the windowsill, her skirts tangling around her legs, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. The building collapsed beneath her. She fell into the water with a scream, the cold stealing her breath. The current grabbed her immediately, pulling her under. She could not tell which way was up. Her skirts wrapped around her legs like iron bands, dragging her down. She could not breathe, could not think, could only feel the terror and the cold and the helpless tumbling as the river threw her about like a rag doll. Her hand struck something solid and she grabbed for it instinctively. A piece of timber, part of the building perhaps. She clung to it with desperate strength, managing to get her head above water long enough to gasp a single breath before the current pulled her under again. She was going to die. The certainty of it filled her mind with a strange, cold clarity. She was going to drown in this terrible brown water, far from home with no one to mourn her or even know what had become of her. Then something grabbed her. A hand, impossibly strong, closed around her wrist. She felt herself being pulled, dragged through the water with such force that she lost her grip on the timber. She broke the surface gasping and choking, and through her blurred vision she saw him. He was enormous. That was her first thought. Broad shoulders straining against a buckskin shirt, arms corded with muscle, a thick beard and hair that fell past his shoulders, dark and wet. His face was all hard angles and bronze skin, his eyes a startling pale blue that seemed to pierce right through her. He had her by the wrist with one hand, and with the other he was swimming, fighting against the current with strokes that seemed impossibly powerful. She could see the strain in his face, the cord standing out in his neck, but he did not let go. She tried to help, tried to kick her legs, but her skirts were too heavy and she was too weak. Every time her face went under the water she thought it was over, but he kept pulling, kept fighting, dragging them both towards something she could not see. It felt like hours, but could only have been minutes. Suddenly her feet struck bottom, and he was hauling her up out of the water, half carrying and half dragging her up a steep slope. Her legs would not hold her and she collapsed, coughing and retching up what felt like gallons of river water. They were on high ground, a rocky outcropping that rose above the flood. Below them, the river raged past, carrying with it the remains of granite. She could see buildings floating past, spinning lazily in the current. Bodies too, though she looked away quickly. The man who had saved her was on his hands and knees beside her, breathing hard. Water streamed from his hair and clothes. He was even bigger than she had first thought, well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders like an ox and hands that looked like they could crush stone. His buckskin clothing clung to him, revealing the powerful muscles of his chest and arms and legs. He looked at her, those pale blue eyes assessing. "Can you breathe?" She nodded, still coughing. Her throat burned and her chest ached, and she was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. "Good." He stood up, moving with a grace that seemed impossible for someone his size. "We need to get higher. This might not be high enough if there is more coming." "I cannot," she managed to say. "I cannot walk." He looked down at her for a moment. Then without a word he bent and scooped her up in his arms as if she weighed nothing. She gasped and instinctively put her arms around his neck. He began climbing higher, his breathing steady despite carrying her weight and having just battled the flood. They reached a higher shelf of rock, this one backed by a small cave. He carried her inside and set her down gently on the stone floor. The cave was shallow, maybe 15 feet deep, but it was dry and out of the wind. "Stay here," he said. "I will get a fire going." Josephine watched as he moved around the cave with sure efficiency. He seemed to know exactly what he was doing, gathering dried wood from a stack that was already there, along with what looked like supplies. This was his place, she realized. He lived here, or at least spent time here. Within minutes he had a fire burning. The warmth was immediate and blessed. He came back to her and knelt down, his big hands surprisingly gentle as he checked her over. "Anything broken?" "I do not think so." Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "I cannot feel my fingers. That is the cold." "You need to get out of those wet clothes." She stared at him and he shook his head. "I will turn around. I have blankets. You will die if you stay in wet clothes." He was right, of course. She was already shaking violently and her lips felt numb. He stood and went to the back of the cave, returning with several thick wool blankets. He set them beside her, then turned his back. Josephine struggled with the buttons of her dress. Her fingers would not work properly, clumsy and numb. She got her dress off but could not manage the laces of her corset or the buttons of her chemise. She was crying now from cold and fear and frustration. "I cannot," she said. "I cannot get them undone." He turned around and she saw something soften in his hard face. He knelt beside her again. "I will help. Just close your eyes if that makes it easier." She did, squeezing them shut as his big fingers worked at the laces and buttons with surprising dexterity. He was quick and efficient, clinical almost, and when she was down to just her undergarments he wrapped her in the blankets before she could feel too exposed. "Those two," he said, nodding at her wet undergarments. "I will get my spare clothes." When he turned around again, she managed to strip off the last of her wet things and wrap herself completely in the blankets. They smelled of wood smoke and pine and something else, something that must be him. They were warm and soft and she pulled them tight around herself. He came back with what looked like a shirt and pants made of the same buckskin as his own clothes. "They will be too big, but they are dry. Get dressed while I change." He moved to the other side of the cave and turned his back again. Josephine struggled into the clothes, which were indeed far too large. The shirt hung to her knees and the pants kept trying to fall down until she rolled the waistband several times. But they were dry and warm, and that was all that mattered. When she looked up, he had changed as well, wearing different buckskin clothing that was just as worn and practical as the first set. He came and sat by the fire, feeding it more wood until it blazed high. "Come here," he said, patting the ground beside him. "You need to warm up." She moved closer to the fire and to him. The heat felt wonderful. She held her hands out to the flames, wincing as feeling began to return to her fingers in painful prickles. They sat in silence for a long moment. Outside the cave, the roar of the flood continued, but it seemed distant now, muted. She was alive. Against all odds, she was alive. "Thank you," she finally said, turning to look at him. "You saved my life. I do not even know your name." "Jacob Cole," he said. His voice was deep and rough as if he did not use it often. "Most just call me Cole." "I am Josephine Fairweather." Josephine, not Josie or Joe, just Josephine. The corners of his mouth twitched, almost but not quite a smile. "All right, just Josephine." Despite everything, she found herself smiling back. "Where did you come from? How did you happen to be there right when I needed help?" "I live up here," he said, gesturing vaguely at the cave and the mountain around them. "Been watching the river since yesterday. Knew it was going to go. Was heading down to warn folks when it broke. Saw you fall from the building." "You swam into that water after me," she said slowly, the reality of it hitting her. "You could have died." He shrugged those massive shoulders. "Could not just watch you drown. Most men would have." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she felt something shift in the air between them. "I am not most men." That was certainly true. She had never seen anyone like Jacob Cole. His size alone was remarkable, but there was something else about him, something in the way he moved and spoke and looked at the world. He seemed utterly comfortable in his own skin, completely at ease in this harsh wilderness in a way she could never imagine being. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked. "4 years, maybe 5, I lose track sometimes. Alone, mostly. I trap in the winter, hunt year-round, trade furs and meat in town when I need supplies." He poked at the fire with a stick. "It is a good life. Lonely, though. Sometimes." He did not elaborate, and she did not push. They sat in silence again, but it was a comfortable silence now. The fire crackled and the warmth seeped into her bones. She was exhausted, she realized. Exhausted and overwhelmed, and still not entirely sure she was not dreaming. "What were you doing in Granite?" Cole asked. She told him about coming west to teach, about the burned school and being stranded, about having nowhere to go and no way to get there even if she did, about taking in mending to earn her keep while she tried to figure out what to do. She found herself telling him things she had not told anyone, about her father's death and the debts and the cold disapproval of Boston society when they realized she had nothing. He listened without interrupting, his eyes on the fire. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "That is rough," he said. "But you are tougher than you look, I think. Not many city women would have held on long enough for me to reach them. I did not have much choice. There is always a choice. You could have let go, could have given up. You did not." She thought about that. He was right, she realized. She had been terrified, more terrified than she had ever been in her life, but she had not given up. She had fought to stay alive, had clung to that timber with every ounce of strength she possessed. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Is the whole town gone?" "Most of it, I would guess. The buildings on higher ground might have made it, but a lot of people." He trailed off, but she understood. A lot of people had died today. She had seen the bodies in the water. "Mrs. Henderson," she said, her voice breaking. "The others at the boarding house. I heard them screaming when the building collapsed. There was nothing you could have done. I know, but it does not make it easier." He reached out then, and his big hand covered hers where it rested on her knee. The gesture was awkward, as if he was not used to offering comfort, but it meant everything. She turned her hand over and squeezed his, grateful beyond words. They stayed like that for a while, hands linked, watching the fire. Outside the cave, the world had been torn apart by water and violence. But inside, in this small space carved from stone, there was warmth and safety and the beginning of something neither of them could name yet. Eventually, exhaustion overcame her. She felt her head nodding, jerking upright each time only to start sinking again. Cole noticed. "You should sleep," he said. "I will keep watch. What if the water rises more, we are high enough, and I will wake you if anything changes." She wanted to argue, wanted to stay awake and keep talking to this strange man who had saved her life, but her body had other ideas. He helped her lie down near the fire, covering her with more blankets. The last thing she saw before sleep took her was his silhouette against the firelight, solid and unmovable as the mountain itself. When she woke, the light filtering into the cave had changed. It was afternoon, she thought, though she could not be sure. The fire was still burning and Cole was sitting exactly where he had been before, though he had changed position slightly. He was sharpening a large knife with a whetstone, the rhythmic scraping sound oddly soothing. He looked up when she stirred. "How do you feel?" "Sore," she admitted, sitting up. Her whole body ached and there were bruises on her arms and legs that she did not remember getting, but alive. That is what matters. He set aside the knife and whetstone. "Are you hungry?" She realized she was starving. "Yes." He had dried meat and something that looked like flatbread, along with what he said was pemmican. The food was plain but filling, and she ate with more appetite than she had felt in weeks. He also had water stored in a leather bag, clean and cold. "I will need to go down and see what is left of town," he said when they had finished eating. "See if anyone needs help. I should come with you." He looked at her steadily. "It will not be pleasant. A lot of people died." "I know, but I cannot just hide up here. I need to know who survived. I need to help if I can." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but you stay close to me, understood?" "Understood." They left the cave an hour later. Cole had given her a pair of moccasins that were too big but stayed on her feet when she wrapped them with strips of leather. The buckskin clothes were strange to move in, but they were practical in a way her Boston dresses had never been. The walk down the mountain was treacherous. The flood had scoured away vegetation and topsoil, leaving raw rock and deep gullies. Cole moved sure-footed as a mountain goat, and several times he had to help her across difficult sections. Each time his hands were gentle but firm, steadying her with his strength. The smell hit them before they reached what was left of granite. It was the smell of death and destruction, of mud and standing water and things she did not want to think about. Cole's face went hard and grim. The town was devastated. Fully half the buildings were gone completely, washed away by the flood. The others stood damaged and listing, coated in mud and debris. Bodies lay scattered everywhere, caught in debris or lying in the mud where the water had left them. But there were survivors, too. She could hear voices, people calling out, and as they got closer, she could see groups of people picking through the wreckage, looking for survivors or salvaging what they could. The next hours passed in a blur of horror and heroism. Cole immediately joined the search efforts, and Josephine worked alongside him. His strength was invaluable, moving debris that would have taken 3 normal men to shift. He found 2 children alive, trapped in the remains of their house with their mother dead beside them. He found an old man clinging to life in the upper floor of the general store. He found others, too, who had not been so lucky. Josephine helped where she could. She tended to the injured, tearing strips from her borrowed shirt to make bandages. She helped calm the children, holding them while they cried for lost parents. She worked until her hands were raw and her back ached, and she could barely stand. As night fell, the survivors gathered in what remained of the church, which stood on the highest ground in town and had escaped the worst of the flood. There were perhaps 60 people there, out of a town that had held over 200. The loss was staggering. Reverend Mills, who had lost his own wife in the flood, led them in prayer. Josephine sat beside Cole, their shoulders touching, drawing strength from his presence. His face was haggard, his clothes covered in mud and blood, but he had not stopped working the entire day. After the prayer, people began discussing what to do next. Some wanted to rebuild. Others wanted to leave to go to Helena or Virginia City or back east. There was talk of sending riders to get help, to bring supplies and medicine. Cole spoke for the first time. "The trail to Helena is washed out. I saw it on the way down. It will be weeks before wagons can get through." "What about Virginia City?" someone asked. "That trail is probably gone too. The whole valley flooded. Nothing will be getting in or out for a while." There was silence as people absorbed this. They were on their own, at least for now. "We have to bury the dead," Mrs. Kimball said quietly. She had survived along with her husband, both of them pulled from the wreckage of the boarding house by Cole. "We cannot leave them lying in the streets." Everyone agreed with that. They formed work parties for the next day. Cole volunteered to hunt, to bring in fresh meat. Others would try to salvage what food they could from the ruins. Still others would begin the grim task of collecting and burying the bodies. When the meeting broke up, people settled down to sleep wherever they could find space. The church was crowded and the mood was somber. Cole touched Josephine's elbow. "Come on," he said quietly. "We will go back to my place." Should we not stay and help? We will come back tomorrow. But you need real rest, and it will be quieter up there. She did not argue. The thought of spending the night in the crowded, grief-filled church was overwhelming. She followed him out into the darkness. The climb back up the mountain was harder than coming down had been. She was exhausted, and every step was an effort. Twice she stumbled and would have fallen if Cole had not caught her. The second time he simply swept her up into his arms and carried her the rest of the way. She should have protested, should have insisted she could walk, but she was too tired. Instead, she let her head rest against his broad chest, feeling the steady thump of his heart beneath her ear, and allowed herself to feel safe. Back in the cave, he built up the fire and made her eat more dried meat and pemmican even though she said she was not hungry. Then he made her lie down by the fire and covered her with the blankets. "Sleep," he said. "I will be right here." "Where will you sleep?" "I will keep watch for a while, then I will sleep over there." He nodded to the other side of the cave. "Cole," she said as he started to turn away. "Thank you for everything. I do not think anyone else would have done what you did today." Something shifted in his eyes, something that might have been pain or might have been something else. "Just doing what needs doing. It is more than that. You risked your life for me. You worked all day helping people you do not even know. You gave up your food and your blankets and your home to help. They needed help, I know, but you did not have to give it. Most people would have just looked after themselves." She paused, trying to find the words for what she was feeling. "You are a good man, Jacob Cole." He looked away, and in the firelight she could see color rising in his weathered cheeks. "Sleep now, we have more work tomorrow." She slept, and this time her dreams were not of drowning but of strong hands pulling her to safety, of pale blue eyes that saw more than they revealed, of a man carved from the same granite as the mountains around them. The next days passed in exhausting labor. Each morning, Cole and Josephine would go down to the town to help with whatever was needed. Cole hunted in the early mornings and late evenings, bringing in deer and elk that were butchered and smoked to feed the survivors. Josephine helped tend the injured, mind the children who had lost their parents, and do the 100 other tasks that needed doing. They fell into a routine. Wake at dawn, eat a quick breakfast, go down the mountain. Work all day. Return to the cave at night, eat dinner, talk by the fire before sleeping. It was a simple rhythm, but there was something comforting about it. And as the days passed, Josephine found herself noticing more about Jacob Cole. The way he moved with such economical grace despite his size. The way his hands, which could snap a man's arm like a twig, were infinitely gentle when dealing with a frightened child. The way his face, which looked so hard and severe in repose, softened when he smiled, which he was starting to do more often around her. He was nothing like the men she had known in Boston. They had been soft and civilized, more concerned with their appearance and social standing than anything of substance. Cole cared nothing for appearances. His clothes were practical, his hair was long and often tangled, his beard was thick and untrimmed. But he was more of a man than any of them had ever been. She noticed other things too. The way her heart beat faster when he was near. The way she found herself looking for him whenever they were apart. The way his touch, even just his hand on her elbow to steady her on the path, sent shivers through her. The way she slept better knowing he was nearby, keeping watch. She was falling for him. The realization should have terrified her. She barely knew him. They came from completely different worlds. He was a mountain man who lived in a cave, and she was a Boston schoolteacher. It made no sense, but the heart, she was learning, did not care about sense. One evening, about 2 weeks after the flood, they were sitting by the fire in the cave when Cole spoke. "The trails will be passable soon," he said. "Maybe another week or two. People will start leaving." Her heart clenched. What about you? Will you stay here? This is my home. Where else would I go? He poked at the fire. What about you? Will you go back east? I have nothing back east. No family, no home, no prospects. I could not afford passage even if I wanted to go back. What will you do then? She had been thinking about that question for days. I suppose I will stay in Granite if Granite still exists. Help rebuild. They will need a teacher eventually. That could take months, maybe longer. And living in town will not be easy. Most of the buildings are gone and winter will come eventually. He was right, of course. She had no idea how she would survive the coming months, let alone the winter. But what choice did she have? They sat in silence for a while. Then Cole spoke again, his voice rough and uncertain in a way she had never heard before. You could stay here. She looked at him sharply. He was staring into the fire, not meeting her eyes, and there was color in his cheeks again. Here, she repeated. In the cave. It is not much, but it is warm and dry and I always have enough food. I could. He trailed off, then started again. I could take care of you, keep you safe. Her heart was hammering now. Cole, what are you saying? I am saying. He finally looked at her, and the intensity in his pale eyes stole her breath. I'm saying I do not want you to leave. I know I have no right to ask. I know I am not the kind of man a woman like you would want. I have nothing to offer you except this cave and my protection and whatever I can hunt or trap. But these past 2 weeks, having you here, talking to you, working beside you, it has been the best weeks of my life, and the thought of you leaving, of never seeing you again. He looked away. It hurts. Josephine felt tears prick her eyes. She reached out and put her hand on his cheek, turning his face back to hers. His beard was rough beneath her palm, but his skin was warm. Jacob Cole, she said softly, you are exactly the kind of man a woman like me would want. You are brave and kind and strong and honorable. You risked your life to save mine. You have worked yourself to exhaustion helping people who are nothing to you. You have shared your home and your food and your protection without asking for anything in return. Any woman would be lucky to have you. Then stay, he said, and his voice was raw with emotion. Please, Josephine, stay with me. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will stay. The joy that flooded his face was beautiful to see. He reached up and covered her hand with his where it still rested on his cheek. His hand was so much bigger than hers, calloused and scarred from years of hard living, but his touch was achingly gentle. I will take care of you, he said. I swear it. You will never want for anything I can provide. I know. I trust you. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. She did not want to. She met him halfway, and when his lips touched hers, it felt like coming home. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if he was afraid of breaking her. But when she pressed closer, her free hand coming up to tangle in his long hair, he deepened the kiss with a groan that sent heat flooding through her body. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. I have never felt this way about anyone, he said quietly. I did not even know I could feel this way. Neither did I, she admitted. But Cole, there is something we need to discuss. He pulled back slightly to look at her, and she saw worry in his eyes. If I stay here with you, people will talk. They will assume things. I do not care what people think. I do not either, really, but I care about propriety, at least to a degree, and I care about my reputation, what little I have left. She took a deep breath. If we are going to do this, I think we should do it properly. What do you mean? I mean we should get married. The word hung in the air between them. Cole stared at her, his eyes wide. Married, he repeated. You want to marry me? If you want to marry me, yes. Want to. He laughed, the sound rough and disbelieving. Josephine, I have dreamed of having someone to share my life with for years, but I never thought. I mean, look at me. I am a mountain man who lives in a cave. What woman would want that? "I would," she said firmly. "I do not need a fancy house or fine things. I just need you, and if we are going to share a life, share this cave, then I want to do it as your wife." He kissed her again, fierce and joyful. "Yes," he said against her lips. "Yes, let us get married." The next day they went down to Granite and found Reverend Mills. He was overseeing the construction of temporary shelters, but he stopped when Cole approached him. "Reverend," Cole said, his voice formal and a bit stiff, "we would like to get married." The Reverend blinked in surprise, looking between Cole and Josephine. "Married? Well, that is wonderful news. We could use some good news around here." He smiled warmly. "When were you thinking?" "As soon as possible," Josephine said. "Today, if that can be arranged. Today." The Reverend looked thoughtful. "I suppose there is no reason to wait. Let me gather some witnesses, and we can do it right now if you like." They were married an hour later in front of the ruined church, with Mrs. Kimball and several other survivors as witnesses. Josephine wore the buckskin clothes Cole had given her, with a wreath of wildflowers in her hair that Mrs. Kimball had helped her gather. Cole wore his best buckskin shirt, the one with intricate beadwork that he said he had traded for 3 winters ago. The ceremony was simple and brief. They had no rings, but Cole took her hand in his and spoke his vows in a voice that rang clear and true. She spoke hers with tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the enormity of what they were doing and the rightness of it. When Reverend Mills pronounced them man and wife, Cole kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weak. The witnesses cheered and clapped, and for a moment the grief and loss that hung over the town lifted. They stayed in town for the rest of the day, accepting congratulations and well wishes. People seemed genuinely happy for them, and several women pulled Josephine aside to tell her she was lucky to have found such a good man. She agreed wholeheartedly. That evening they climbed back up to the cave as man and wife. Josephine felt nervous in a way she had not expected. She knew what was expected on a wedding night, though her knowledge was more theoretical than practical. Her mother had tried to explain things before she died, awkward and vague, and she had gleaned bits and pieces from married friends over the years. Cole must have sensed her nervousness because he was careful and patient. He built up the fire and made dinner, chatting about inconsequential things, giving her time to adjust. After they ate, he sat beside her by the fire and took her hand. "We do not have to do anything tonight," he said quietly. "I know this is all very fast. We have only known each other 2 weeks. If you need time, I understand." She looked at this man who was now her husband, this strong, gentle, honorable man who had saved her life and stolen her heart. She did not need time. She needed him. "I do not want to wait," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am your wife. I want to be your wife in every way." The heat that flared in his eyes made her shiver. He stood and drew her to her feet, then led her deeper into the cave where he had laid out furs and blankets to make a soft bed. The firelight barely reached here, and the shadows flickered and danced on the stone walls. He kissed her slowly, thoroughly, until she was breathless and clinging to him. His hands were gentle as he helped her undress, and when she stood before him wearing nothing but the firelight, he looked at her with such reverence that she felt beautiful despite her bruises and scars from the flood. "You are so lovely," he whispered, his voice rough. "I do not deserve you." "Yes, you do," she said, reaching for him. "And I do not deserve you, so I suppose we are even." He smiled at that, a real smile that transformed his face, and then he was kissing her again. He was gentle with her, patient, taking his time despite his obvious desire. He showed her pleasure she had never imagined, made her feel things she had not known were possible. There was pain, too, at first, but he was careful and she trusted him completely. And when the pain faded, and there was only pleasure and connection and the feeling of being completely joined with him. She thought her heart might burst from the joy of it. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in the furs, her head on his broad chest, his arms wrapped around her. She could hear his heart beating beneath her ear, steady and strong like the man himself. "I love you," she said quietly. She had not planned to say it, but the words came out anyway, true and inevitable. "I know it is too soon and too fast, but I do. I love you, Jacob Cole." His arms tightened around her. "I love you too, Josephine Cole. From the moment I pulled you out of that river, I think I have loved you." She tilted her head to look at him, and in the dim firelight she could see the truth of it in his eyes. He kissed her forehead, her nose, her lips, each kiss a promise and a vow. They made love again, slower this time, learning each other's bodies in the flickering light. And later, as she drifted toward sleep in her husband's arms, Josephine thought that she had never been happier in her entire life. The next weeks passed in a blur of adjustment and discovery. During the days, they continued to help in Granite as the town slowly began to rebuild. Some people had left, heading to Helena or Virginia City or back east. But many stayed, determined to restore what the flood had destroyed. Cole's hunting kept many people fed during those difficult weeks. He would rise before dawn and return with deer or elk, or sometimes smaller game. The meat was distributed among those who needed it most, and people began to regard him with a respect that bordered on awe. This huge, quiet man who lived on the mountain and asked nothing for himself had become the town's guardian in a way. Josephine found her own role. She tended the sick and injured, taught the children who had lost their parents, helped the women with cooking and cleaning and the 100 other tasks that needed doing. She also began gathering and preserving wild plants under the guidance of a widow named Mrs. Patterson, who knew which plants were edible and which had medicinal properties. But it was the evenings that Josephine treasured most. When they returned to their cave, it was like entering a different world. There, they were not helpers or guardians or anything but themselves. They were just Cole and Josephine, husband and wife, learning to build a life together. Cole taught her about the wilderness, how to read the signs of weather and animals, how to preserve food, how to move through the forest without leaving a trace. She taught him things too, though she had not realized she had anything to teach. She taught him about books and poetry, reciting passages she had memorized years ago. She taught him about music, singing songs she remembered from childhood. She taught him that it was all right to laugh, to be silly sometimes, to let his guard down. And slowly, the walls he had built around his heart crumbled. He began to talk more, to share stories of his past that he had never told anyone. He had been a soldier in the war, he told her one night, fighting for the Union. He had seen terrible things, done terrible things, and when the war ended, he had not been able to go back to civilization. The wilderness had healed him in ways nothing else could. She understood. The wilderness was healing her too, though she had not known she needed healing. The strictures and expectations of Boston society had weighed on her in ways she had not fully recognized until she was free of them. Here, she could be herself completely. Here, she was valued for what she could do, not for her family connections or her dowry or her ability to navigate social situations. One evening in late June, almost 2 months after the flood, Cole came back from hunting with news. "The trail to Helena is fully passable now," he said. "Wagons can get through. The territorial governor is sending supplies and men to help rebuild." Josephine felt her heart sink. She knew what this meant. Life would start returning to normal. People would have less need for Cole's hunting and her help. They would retreat back to their cave, back to their isolated life. She found she did not mind. These weeks of helping in town had been rewarding, but she was ready to focus on building her own life, her own home with her husband. But Cole surprised her. "I was thinking," he said that night as they lay together in their bed of furs. "Maybe we should build a cabin." She propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "A cabin? This cave has served me well, but it is not much of a home for a woman, for a wife." He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I want to build you a proper house. Nothing fancy, but something with real walls and a real floor and a real roof. Something we can make our own." Tears pricked her eyes. "I love the cave. I am happy here. I know. But I want to give you more. You deserve more." He pulled her down and kissed her gently. "Besides, we might need more room eventually." "More room for what?" His hand moved to rest on her flat belly and understanding dawned. Heat flooded her cheeks. "I am not. I mean, I do not know if." "Not yet, maybe," he said. "But someday, if we are blessed. I would like children, Josephine." "Would you?" She thought about it, imagining a child with Cole's pale blue eyes and her dark hair, growing up wild and free in these mountains. The image filled her with a longing so intense it took her breath away. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I would like that very much." They began work on the cabin the next week. Cole chose a spot about half a mile from the cave, on a flat area with good drainage and a clear view of the valley below. It was close to a spring that provided fresh water and sheltered from the worst winds by a stand of tall pines. He felled trees and stripped them, shaping logs with an expertise that came from years of wilderness living. Josephine helped where she could, though mostly she felt useless. But Cole was patient with her, showing her how to notch the logs and how to mix mud and moss for chinking. Several men from town came up to help when they heard what Cole was doing. It was their way of repaying him for all the meat he had provided, for the lives he had saved during the flood. With their help, the cabin went up quickly. It was a simple structure, just one large room with a loft above for sleeping. But it had a real stone fireplace that Cole built with his own hands, real glass windows that he purchased in town with money from his furs, and a solid wooden door with iron hinges. It even had a wooden floor, smooth and level, instead of bare earth or stone. Josephine loved it. She loved every rough-hewn log, every crack that needed chinking, every imperfection that made it uniquely theirs. When the roof was finally complete and the cabin was weathertight, she walked through it with tears streaming down her face. "It is perfect," she told Cole. "Absolutely perfect." He grinned, that full smile that transformed his face and made her heart skip. "It is ours." They moved in on a warm July evening, carrying their few possessions from the cave. The cabin felt huge after the cave, and their voices echoed strangely. They built a fire in the new fireplace and made love on the floor in front of it, christening their new home in the most primal way possible. As summer progressed, they settled into their new life. Cole still hunted and trapped, and Josephine had taken over a large garden plot near the cabin. Mrs. Patterson had given her seeds and taught her what to plant, and to her surprise, Josephine found she loved gardening. There was something deeply satisfying about putting seeds in the ground and watching them grow, about harvesting vegetables she had grown with her own hands. She also started teaching again. Several families in Granite had asked if she would teach their children, and she agreed. 3 times a week she would go down to town and teach in a makeshift schoolhouse that had been set up in a tent. It was not much, but it was a start. Life was hard in ways it had never been in Boston. Her hands became calloused from work, her skin tanned from the sun, her body lean and strong from constant physical labor. But she had never been happier. Every morning she woke beside the man she loved. Every day brought new challenges and new joys, and every night she fell into bed exhausted but content, fulfilled in a way she had never been in her old life. In late August, she realized her monthly courses had not come. At first, she thought it was just the stress and physical labor delaying them. But when September came and went with no sign of her courses, she began to wonder. She told Cole one evening as they sat on the porch he had built in front of the cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains. "I think I might be with child," she said quietly. He went very still beside her. Then he turned to look at her, his eyes wide. "You think? My courses have not come in 2 months, and I have been feeling strange, queasy in the mornings. I am not certain, but I think—" She did not get to finish the sentence. Cole swept her up in his arms and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. She clung to him, laughing too, her heart soaring. "We are going to have a baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "A baby, Josephine." "Maybe," she cautioned. "I am not completely certain. You are certain enough." He set her down gently and immediately became serious. "You should not be lifting heavy things. No more hauling water, I will do all that. And maybe you should stop going down to teach. The walk is too much." She laughed at his sudden protectiveness. "Cole, women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I am not going to break. I know, but I want to keep you safe. Both of you safe." His hand moved to rest on her belly, and the tenderness in his eyes made her want to cry, "Mrs." Patterson confirmed her suspicions 2 weeks later when Josephine finally got up the nerve to ask her. The older woman examined her with experienced hands and announced that yes, she was indeed expecting, probably due in late March or early April. Cole was impossibly attentive after that. He would barely let her do anything, insisting on doing all the heavy work himself. It drove her a bit mad, but she loved him for it. He was going to be a wonderful father, she thought, patient and protective and full of love. Winter came early that year, with the first snow falling in October. By November they were snowed in, the cabin surrounded by deep drifts that made travel to town impossible. But they had prepared well. The cabin was stocked with dried meat and vegetables from the garden, along with plenty of firewood. They had everything they needed. Those winter months were some of the happiest of Josephine's life. Cut off from the outside world, it was just the two of them in their little cabin. They spent long evenings by the fire, talking and reading and making love. Cole carved wooden bowls and spoons while she sewed baby clothes from soft buckskin. They made plans for the future, dreaming of the family they would build together. Her belly grew steadily larger, and Cole was fascinated by it. He would spend hours with his hand on her belly, feeling the baby move inside her. The first time he felt a kick, his face lit up with such wonder that she started crying. "Our baby," he whispered. "Our baby is in there." "Our baby," she agreed, covering his hand with hers. The winter was harsh, with temperatures dropping far below freezing and snowstorms that lasted for days. But inside their cabin it was warm and cozy. Cole had built the fireplace well, and it threw out tremendous heat. They slept in the loft, buried under layers of furs and blankets, their bodies twined together. Spring came slowly, the snow melting in fits and starts through March. Josephine was huge now, her belly so swollen she could barely see her feet. She was uncomfortable and ungainly, but Cole never made her feel anything but beautiful. He would help her dress and undress, would rub her aching back and swollen feet, would hold her when the baby's movements kept her awake at night. Mrs. Patterson made the journey up to the cabin in early April when the trails were finally passable. She examined Josephine and announced that the baby would come soon, probably within the week. She agreed to stay until after the birth, and Cole gave up the loft to her and moved his and Josephine's bed downstairs by the fireplace. The baby came 3 days later in the early hours of the morning. Josephine's labor started just after midnight, and by dawn she was in agony. She had never felt pain like this, had not imagined anything could hurt so much. But Cole was there the whole time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, whispering words of encouragement. Mrs. Patterson was calm and efficient, guiding Josephine through each contraction, telling her when to push and when to breathe. And finally, after hours of labor that felt like an eternity, the baby came into the world with a lusty cry. "It is a boy, Mrs. Patterson announced, holding up the squirming, red infant. A big, healthy boy. Cole was crying, tears streaming down his weathered face as he stared at his son. Mrs. Patterson cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft blanket, then placed him in Josephine's arms. He was perfect. Tiny and wrinkled and red, but perfect. He had a shock of dark hair, and when he opened his eyes, they were pale blue like his father's. Josephine felt her heart crack open with love so intense it was almost painful. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We have been waiting for you." Cole knelt beside the bed, one finger gently touching the baby's tiny hand. The infant's fingers closed around his father's finger with surprising strength, and Cole let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "He is so small," he said in wonder. "I am afraid I will break him." "You will not break him," Josephine assured him. "Here, do you want to hold your son?" She passed the baby carefully to Cole, who cradled him awkwardly but gently against his broad chest. The contrast between the huge, powerful man and the tiny infant was almost comical, but the look on Cole's face was pure love. "Hello, son," Cole said quietly. "I am your father, and I promise I will always keep you safe. I will teach you everything I know. I will love you for all of my days." Josephine was crying now too, overwhelmed by emotion and exhaustion and joy. They had created this perfect little person together, this tiny life that was a combination of both of them. They named him Jonathan, after Josephine's father. Jonathan Cole, born on a spring morning in a cabin on a Montana mountain, with parents who loved him more than life itself. Mrs. Patterson stayed for a week, helping Josephine recover from the birth and teaching her how to care for the baby. Then she returned to town, promising to come back and check on them in a few weeks. Those first weeks with Jonathan were exhausting and wonderful. He was a good baby, nursing well and sleeping in long stretches, but having a newborn was still overwhelming. Josephine was grateful for Cole's help. He changed diapers and walked the floor with a fussy baby, and sang terrible off-key lullabies that somehow always worked. Watching Cole with their son made Josephine fall in love with him all over again. This strong, fierce man who could bring down an elk with a single shot was completely undone by a tiny infant. He was gentle and patient and utterly devoted, and she knew without a doubt that she had made the right choice in marrying him. Summer came again, and with it more changes. The town of Granite had rebuilt significantly, with new buildings going up to replace those lost in the flood. The school had been rebuilt too, a proper building this time with real desks and a wood stove. They wanted Josephine to come teach full-time, but she declined. Her place was here on the mountain, with her family. She did agree to teach during the summer months when the trails were passable, and she could bring Jonathan with her. Cole built a cradle that she could carry on her back, and several times a week she would make the journey down to town with her son secured against her, teaching the children of Granite while her own child slept or gurgled happily. Jonathan grew quickly, thriving in the mountain air. By his first birthday he was walking, chasing after chickens in the yard that Cole had built and getting into everything. He had his father's pale blue eyes and his mother's dark hair, and a smile that could light up a room. Cole was teaching him already, taking him on short walks into the forest, showing him animal tracks and teaching him the names of trees and plants. Jonathan was too young to understand much, but he listened with rapt attention to his father's deep voice, secure in his strong arms. They had everything they needed, Josephine thought. A home, a family, each other. Life was hard, certainly. The winters were brutal and the work never ended, but they were happy, truly happy in a way that money or status or social position could never provide. 2 years after Jonathan was born, Josephine found herself expecting again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Cole was just as protective and attentive, though this time he had Jonathan to care for as well. Their second child, a girl they named Julia, was born in February during a blizzard so fierce that Mrs. Patterson could not make it up from town. Cole delivered his own daughter, his hands steady despite his fear, and when he placed the squirming infant in Josephine's arms, she saw pride and love and wonder in his eyes. Julia was different from Jonathan. Where he had been a calm baby, she was fussy and demanding. Where he had been content to sit and watch, she wanted to be held constantly. She had Josephine's dark eyes and what looked like it would be her father's hair, and a temper that made both her parents laugh. With 2 small children, life became even more hectic. But they managed, working together as a team. Cole would take Jonathan hunting or fishing while Josephine tended to Julia. Then they would switch, and she would take Jonathan to gather berries or tend the garden while Cole walked the floor with a crying Julia. The years passed in a blur of growth and change. Jonathan grew tall and strong, already showing signs of his father's build. He was quiet like Cole, thoughtful and observant, but with his mother's love of learning. Josephine taught him to read from the Bible and the few books she owned, and he absorbed knowledge like a sponge. Julia was wild and fearless, climbing trees and chasing animals and getting into trouble at every turn. She was more like her father in temperament, Josephine thought, stubborn and independent but with a soft heart hidden beneath a tough exterior. When Jonathan was 6 and Julia 4, Josephine found herself expecting again. This pregnancy was the hardest yet, leaving her exhausted and sick for months. Cole worried constantly, but she assured him she was fine. Their third child, another boy they named James, was born in October, arriving early and small but healthy. Their cabin felt crowded now with 5 people, and Cole began talking about adding another room. But before they could start construction, he received word that his brother was dying in Virginia City and wanted to see him one last time. Cole had never mentioned a brother. When Josephine asked about it, he explained that they had been estranged since before the war, some family disagreement he would not elaborate on. But blood was blood, and he needed to go. They made the journey together, all 5 of them, traveling to Virginia City in a wagon Cole borrowed from town. It took a week of hard travel, with the children fussy and tired, and Josephine exhausted from caring for an infant while bouncing along rough roads. Cole's brother lived in a fine house on the edge of town, a successful merchant who had made his fortune in mining supplies. He was dying of consumption, his once robust frame wasted away to skin and bones. The reunion between the brothers was awkward and emotional, years of estrangement melting away in the face of death. They stayed in Virginia City for 2 weeks while Cole spent time with his brother. Josephine used the time to purchase supplies they could not get in Granite, and the children were fascinated by the big town with its noise and bustle. When Cole's brother finally died, Cole inherited a substantial sum of money, much to his surprise. His brother had never married and had no other family. Everything came to Cole. On the journey home, they discussed what to do with the money. They could expand the cabin or build a new house. They could buy cattle or horses. They could even move to town if they wanted, buy a house there and live a more conventional life. But neither of them wanted that. Their cabin on the mountain was home. The wilderness was where they belonged. In the end, they used the money to build a proper addition to the cabin, doubling its size. They added 2 bedrooms, a real kitchen, and a workshop for Cole. They bought a cow and some chickens, making them more self-sufficient. They purchased books for the children, and fabric for clothes, and other small luxuries they would never have been able to afford before. But their life did not change fundamentally. Cole still hunted and trapped. Josephine still taught in town during the summer months. They still lived simply, close to the land and to each other. The children grew. Jonathan became a skilled hunter and tracker, learning everything his father could teach him. Julia learned to shoot and ride as well as any boy, and she was fearless in the wilderness. James, the youngest, was quieter and more thoughtful, with a gift for numbers and a fascination with how things worked. Josephine taught them all to read and write, and gave them what education she could. It was not the same as a real school, but it was more than many children received. And they learned other things too, things no school could teach. They learned to track animals and read weather signs. They learned which plants were edible and which were poisonous. They learned to survive in the wilderness that was their home. The years continued to pass. Josephine's hair began to show streaks of gray, and Cole's beard went from dark brown to silver. Their hands became more weathered, their faces more lined. But the love between them never faded. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year, deepened by shared experiences and the family they had built together. When Jonathan was 16, he announced that he wanted to become a guide, taking people through the mountains and teaching them wilderness skills. Cole was proud, and together they began building a reputation. People came from as far as Helena to hire Jonathan Cole, the young man who knew the mountains like the back of his hand. Julia, at 14, declared that she wanted to be a veterinarian. She had been helping a doctor in Granite who also treated animals, and she had discovered a passion for healing. It was an unusual ambition for a girl, but Josephine and Cole supported her completely. If their daughter wanted to be a veterinarian, they would find a way to make it happen. James, at 12, was already showing signs of a mechanical genius. He could fix anything, build anything, and he spent hours tinkering with tools and machinery. Cole thought he might become an engineer someday. Josephine could hardly believe that the tiny infants she had held in her arms had grown into these capable, confident young people. Time had passed so quickly, each day blending into the next in the rhythm of their mountain life. One evening in late summer, when the sun was setting over the mountains in shades of gold and pink, Josephine sat on the porch with Cole, watching their children. Jonathan was teaching James how to sharpen a knife properly. Julia was reading a veterinary manual that the doctor in town had loaned her, her brow furrowed in concentration. "We did good," Cole said quietly, his hand finding hers. "Look at them. They are strong and smart and good. We did good, Josephine." She squeezed his hand, her eyes filling with tears. "We did. Better than I ever imagined. Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Giving up your old life. You could have gone back east, found another teaching position, married some proper Boston gentleman." She turned to look at him, at this man who had saved her life and given her everything that mattered. His hair was completely silver now, his face deeply lined, but his pale blue eyes were still as clear and intense as they had been that first day when he pulled her from the flood. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for one single second. You are my life, Jacob Cole. You and our children in this place. I would not change anything." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I love you, Josephine. From the moment I pulled you from that river, I have loved you." and I will love you until the day I die and beyond." "I love you too," she whispered, "always and forever." They sat together as the sun set, hands linked, watching their children and counting their blessings. The flood that had destroyed so much had also brought them together, had created this family, this life, this love. 25 years passed, and their lives continued to unfold in the mountains they loved. Jonathan married a woman from Granite and built his own cabin nearby, giving them grandchildren who ran wild through the forest just as their parents had. Julia went to university in the East to study veterinary medicine, a journey paid for by what remained of the inheritance from Cole's brother. She returned 5 years later with a degree and a husband, and set up practice in Granite. James became an engineer as Cole had predicted, working on the railroad and making a name for himself, but he always came home to the mountains for holidays and summers. Cole and Josephine grew old together in the cabin they had built, surrounded by children and grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. Their love never diminished, never faded. If anything, it grew richer and deeper with each passing year, seasoned by decades of shared experiences, shared joys and sorrows, shared life. Cole was 73 when he died, peacefully in his sleep with Josephine beside him. His heart simply stopped beating one winter night, worn out after a life lived fully and well. Josephine woke to find him gone, his hand still holding hers, a slight smile on his weathered face as if he had seen something wonderful in his final moments. She grieved, of course. The loss of him left a hole in her heart that would never fully heal, but she did not regret. How could she regret a single moment of the life they had built together? He had given her everything that mattered: love, family, purpose, a home. He had saved her life that day in the flood, but he had done more than that. He had given her a life worth living. Josephine lived another 5 years after Cole's death, cared for by her children and grandchildren in the cabin that she and Cole had built together. She spent her days sitting on the porch, watching the mountains and remembering the flood and the fear, remembering strong hands pulling her to safety, remembering pale blue eyes looking at her with love, remembering every precious moment of their life together. When she died at the age of 76, it was in the bed she had shared with Cole for over 50 years, surrounded by her family. Her last words were simple: "I am coming, my love. Wait for me." They buried her beside Cole on the mountain they had both loved, under a tall pine tree with a view of the valley below. The headstone was simple, just their names and dates in a single line: "Together always." And in that place, in that cabin built by love and determination, their legacy lived on. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren carried forward the lessons they had taught: to be strong, to be kind, to love fully and without reservation, to build a life that mattered, not by society's standards, but by the standards of the heart. The flood had taken everything from both of them, had swept away their old lives in a torrent of mud and water. But from that destruction had come something beautiful. A love story written in the wilderness, in a cabin on a mountain, in the strong hands of a mountain man and the brave heart of a Boston schoolteacher who learned to call the wild places home. And if you go to that mountain even now, locals say you can sometimes see them. A tall man with silver hair and a woman with dark eyes, walking hand in hand through the forest at sunset, their love eternal as the mountains themselves.